Part 1F. War. Most major wars are rackets to make money. They require governments to borrow or create large sums to finance these wars. Also, large corporations with close ties, often the heads of the corporations are swapped with the government, i.e., for instance, Vice President Cheney, to profit from the sale of military equipment and reconstruction of communities that war has devastated. These wars are often set up to coerce populations which are normally war adverse to agree. For instance, before the First World War, most Americans were loath to join. The sinking of the Lusitania by the Germans, with 1,200 people aboard and killed, changed this. What many don't know is that before that, Wilson's financial advisor was asked by a British parliamentarian, what would America do if a passenger boat with Americans aboard was sunk by Germans? The Lithuania was then sent into an area that Germans' U-boats were targeting ships. America had even been warned by the Germans, advised to avoid this area. The war accumulated $16 million in profits, which went to very few. The Second World War. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Before this, the president was elected on the promise that America would not enter the World War. 83% of the population did not want the war. After the attack, 1 million soldiers volunteered. But Japan was provoked. The U.S. wanted Japan to act first. U.S. had halted all trade to Japan, frozen Japanese assets, sent aid to Japanese enemies against so-called war treaties, and had broken the Japanese communication codes, so knew of the impending attack and failed to stop the invasion. Who profited? J.D. Rockefeller, through I.G. Farben, supplied 84% of Germany's explosives. The German Air Force required an additive to the gasoline to operate, which came from Rockefeller's Standard Oil, again through Farben. The bombing of London was made possible by $20 million sale of fuel to the Germans. The Union Bank Corporation helped finance Hitler's rise to power. It was cited for trading with the enemy. Who was the director? Prescott Bush. Father and grandfather of the two presidents. Vietnam. Here, the pretext was the sinking of the PT boats in the Gulf of Tonkin by the Vietnam, except it never happened. Also, the so-called rules of engagements were there to prolong the war, not to win it. Vietnam even knew the rules of engagement, so they knew how to avoid being bombed. Troops were not allowed to bomb potential missile launching sites until they were active. They were not allowed to pursue the enemy across borders. They needed permission for any major offensive from high command. September 11. This attack was staged. The World Trade Center buildings were built to withstand any collision by airplanes. And fuel oil cannot melt still. The two buildings collapsed exactly the same as a demolition. World Trade Center 5 collapsed without a hit run by an airplane. The steel in the rubble was not mangled but conformed to what would be expected in a controlled demolition. The crime scene was off limits to all but a few. There was molten steel at the crime scene several days after, what would be the case when thermite is used to melt steel. An explosion was heard inside the building. The sample being needed to detach before a controlled demolition can take place. The investigation was undertaken in exactly the reverse order, i.e. starting with the assumption that it collapsed due to the collision and tailoring the evidence to support this, as opposed to first looking at the evidence to determine now what happened. The Pentagon, which is probably the most well-defended building on the planet, was bombed by a pilot who had just learned how to fly. Even a experienced pilot would have difficulty turning the plane around and hitting the Pentagon. And there was no evidence of any plane ever hitting the Pentagon. A hole was shown, which looked more like a hole caused by a rocket rather than a plane. And the grounds were cleared up, as I say, very quickly. Now, as a result of this 9/11 attack, what has happened? Several bad things. Invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, both illegal. And if you look into it further, some people were saying that the purpose was to obtain access to oil. The Patriot Act, which allows anyone who alleges to be a terrorist for their house to be searched with no warrant and have no access to a lawyer, be put into prison, and even to be tortured. Do you need any more convincing? Well, Aaron Russell, a politician who was a former friend, to Nicholas Rockefeller, while talking to him before September 11th, said that an event was needed to allow us, the U.S., to attack Afghanistan. It needed a pipeline to the Caspian Sea to obtain oil. Then Iran, and Venezuela. Also, they needed to proclaim a war on terror, which can never be won, but put more power into the commander-in-chief, the president. The key was to take away liberties, foster fear and division, all to preserve power and stop any opposition to those powers. Ultimately, he said, the biggest one would want to have everyone implanted with a chip which carries all their personal and banking information. Then if anyone opposed them, all they need to do is disable the chip. As well, this was used to enable Homeland Security and the Military Tribune Act, all designed to destroy one's liberties. These measures can therefore be used to curb individuals who dare to oppose any of these powers. These series of steps have been used before, namely by Hitler's rise to power. In 1933, he staged a false flag incident by claiming the German federal building was burned down by Polish troops. He used this to dismantle many of the liberties enjoyed by the German people. He then invaded Poland using Homeland Security as the pretext for the rest. The rest is history. End of part 1.